In a small, quiet town where life moved at a predictable pace, there lived a man named James. He was in his late 40s, with sunken cheeks and weary eyes that carried the weight of years spent battling hardships most people couldn't imagine. James had been homeless for nearly a decade, living on the streets after losing everything: his job, his family, and eventually his voice. A battle with throat cancer had robbed him of his ability to speak, leaving him mute and isolated from the world around him. But James wasn't bitter. He simply accepted his fate, finding solace in silence and surviving day by day. Every morning, James would gather his belongings, a worn-out backpack containing a few clothes, an old blanket, and a tattered notebook, and head to the local park. It was his favorite spot, a place where he could sit under the shade of a large oak tree and watch the world go by without being noticed. People passed him often, some glancing briefly before looking away, others completely ignoring his presence. To them, he was just another faceless figure, part of the background noise of urban life. But James didn't mind. He preferred it that way. Being invisible kept him safe, or so he thought. On this particular afternoon, the air was warm and the park buzzed with activity. Children laughed as they chased each other across the grass, while couples strolled hand in hand along the winding paths. James sat quietly beneath his usual tree, leaning back against its sturdy trunk. His hands rested on his knees, and his gaze wandered lazily over the scene before him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel almost content. But peace is fragile, especially for someone like James. As the hours ticked by, two figures approached him, Officer Mark and Officer Ryan. These two men were familiar faces in the neighborhood, though not in a good way. Known for their short tempers and dismissive attitudes, they often patrolled the area with a sense of authority that bordered on arrogance. To many residents, they were just doing their jobs, but to those on the fringes of society, like James, they represented something far more intimidating: unchecked power. "Hey, you," Officer Mark called out sharply, pointing directly at James. The sudden sound startled him, and he looked up, confusion etched across his weathered face. "Yeah, I'm talking to you. Get up." Mark barked again, his tone dripping with impatience. James hesitated, unsure of what they wanted from him. He tried to communicate through gestures, raising his hands slightly in a questioning manner. But the officers weren't interested in explanations. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" Officer Ryan sneered, exchanging a glance with his partner. They both chuckled, clearly amused by their own joke. James lowered his gaze, trying to make himself smaller, hoping they'd lose interest and move on. But instead, their mockery grew louder. "Oh, I get it. You're playing dumb now." "Huh? Real funny," Ryan said sarcastically, taking a step closer. When James still didn't respond, Officer Mark lost his temper. "You think you're too good to talk to us?" he demanded, kicking James's backpack hard enough to send it skidding across the ground. The impact jolted James, and he instinctively reached out to grab it, clutching it tightly to his chest. It was all he owned, the only thing connecting him to any semblance of identity. Seeing his reaction, the officer smirked, enjoying the power they wielded over him. Without warning, Mark grabbed James by the arm, yanking him to his feet. James stumbled, unprepared for the forceful movement, and fell awkwardly onto the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he bit back a cry, knowing it wouldn't do any good. Ryan joined in, grabbing James's other arm, and together, the two officers dragged him across the park, ignoring the looks of shock from bystanders. No one intervened. No one dared to stand up to them. By the time they reached the edge of the park, James was exhausted and humiliated. The officers shoved him roughly onto the sidewalk, leaving him sprawled there like a piece of trash. "Stay out of here," Mark growled, his voice laced with contempt. Then, without another word, they turned and walked away, their boots clicking against the pavement as if nothing had happened. James lay there for a long time, staring blankly at the sky. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and shame washing over him. He felt small, insignificant, and utterly powerless. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Crying wouldn't change anything. It never had. Slowly he pushed himself to his feet, brushing off the dirt and debris clinging to his clothes. With trembling hands, he picked up his backpack and slung it over his shoulder, retreating into the shadows once more. Unbeknownst to James, however, someone had witnessed the entire incident. Sarah, a young woman in her mid-20s, had been walking, her dog nearby, when she saw the officers confront James. At first, she froze, unsure of what to do. But as the situation escalated, she pulled out her phone and began recording. Her hands shook as she captured every cruel word, every taunt, and every violent action. When the officers finally left, Sarah hesitated, debating whether to approach James. In the end, she decided against it, fearing she might make things worse. Instead, she quietly followed them from a distance, ensuring they didn't return. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, replaying the video she had taken. Each frame filled her with anger and sadness, emotions that churned inside her until she couldn't ignore them anymore. She knew she had to do something. Uploading the footage to social media, she added a caption. "This is what happens when power goes unchecked. We need justice for this man." Within minutes, the post gained traction, sparking outrage among viewers who were appalled by what they saw. Comments flooded in, calling for accountability and demanding answers from the police department. As the video spread, it caught the attention of Lisa, a journalist known for covering stories involving marginalized communities. Intrigued, she reached out to Sarah, asking for permission to use the footage in her reporting. Together, they began piecing together the events of that fateful afternoon, determined to bring the truth to light. Meanwhile, protests erupted outside the police station, with hundreds of people gathering to demand justice for James. Signs read, "Stop police brutality," and "We see you, James," while chants echoed through the streets. For James, none of this was immediately apparent. Still reeling from the encounter, he avoided returning to the park, seeking refuge in quieter corners of the town. Yet, unbeknownst to him, the wheels of change had already begun turning. What started as a single act of cruelty was about to transform into a movement, one that would challenge the status quo and give a voice to those who had long been silenced. And though James remained unaware of the storm brewing around him, his story was about to take center stage, forcing the world to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and humanity. The video of James being taunted and kicked out by officers Mark and Ryan spread like wildfire. By the next morning, it had been viewed millions of times, shared across platforms, and discussed in living rooms, workplaces, and schools. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. A mute, homeless man, vulnerable and defenseless, subjected to such cruelty at the hands of those sworn to protect him. The outrage grew louder with every passing hour, fueled by hashtags like "Justice for James" and "Enough is enough." Social media became a battleground for opinions, but one thing was clear: the public demanded accountability. Sarah, the young woman who had recorded the incident, found herself thrust into the spotlight. Overnight, she went from being an ordinary citizen walking her dog to a symbol of courage for standing up against injustice. News outlets reached out to interview her. Activists praised her bravery, and strangers thanked her for shining a light on something dark. But Sarah didn't feel heroic. She felt conflicted. "I just did what anyone should have done," she told Lisa, the journalist covering the story. "It wasn't enough to stop them in the moment. I wish I could have done more." Lisa, on the other hand, saw this as an opportunity to expose systemic issues within law enforcement. She spent days digging deeper, interviewing residents, reviewing past complaints filed against officers Mark and Ryan, and uncovering patterns of misconduct that painted a troubling picture. Her investigation revealed that the two officers had a history of aggressive behavior, particularly toward marginalized groups. Yet their actions had gone unchecked for years due to lack of evidence or fear of retaliation. This time, however, things were different. There was undeniable proof thanks to Sarah's footage, and the public was watching closely. Meanwhile, protests erupted outside the police station. Hundreds of people gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding justice not only for James but also for countless others who had suffered silently under similar circumstances. Some protesters carried banners with James's face printed on them, while others held candles in solidarity. Among the crowd were members of local advocacy, groups, community leaders, and even families bringing their children to witness the power of collective action. The atmosphere was charged with emotion. Anger, frustration, and hope mingled together as voices rose in unison. Inside the police station, tension mounted. Officers Mark and Ryan were called in for questioning, their faces pale and expressions defensive. They tried to justify their actions, claiming they were merely enforcing park rules and dealing with a non-compliant individual. Their excuses fell flat when confronted with the video, which showed no attempt at communication or de-escalation. Internal Affairs launched an investigation, reviewing body cam footage, which mysteriously malfunctioned during the incident, and interviewing witnesses. Despite their denials, the writing was on the wall. The officers were in serious trouble. The pressure extended beyond the police department. City officials scrambled to respond to the growing backlash, issuing statements condemning the officers' behavior and promising reforms. A town hall meeting was scheduled to address concerns and hear directly from citizens. Dozens of people lined up to speak, sharing personal stories of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. One elderly woman recounted how she had been stopped and searched without cause. A teenage boy described being profiled because of his race. Each story added fuel to the fire, underscoring the urgent need for change. Amidst all the chaos, James remained unaware of the movement building around him. Still shaken from the encounter, he avoided populated areas, retreating further into solitude. He spent his days wandering aimlessly, searching for scraps of food and places to rest where he wouldn't draw attention. His mind replayed the humiliation over and over again, the taunts, the kicks, the rough handling. Though he had endured hardships before, this felt different. It wasn't just physical pain. It was the crushing weight of being treated as less than human. One afternoon, as James sat on a bench near the outskirts of town, Lisa approached him cautiously. She introduced herself gently, explaining that she was a journalist working on a story about what had happened. At first, James looked away, wary of strangers, but Lisa persisted, showing him kindness and patience. She assured him that she wanted to help, not exploit his suffering. Slowly, James began to trust her. Through gestures and written notes in his tattered notebook, he shared bits of his story, his battle with cancer, his loss of speech, and the struggles of living on the streets. Lisa listened intently, her heart breaking with each revelation. With Lisa's encouragement, James agreed to meet David, a lawyer specializing in civil rights cases. David was known for taking on difficult cases involving abuse of power, and he immediately recognized the significance of James's situation. Sitting across from James in a quiet cafe, David explained the legal options available. "No one deserves to be treated like that," he said firmly, "especially not by someone whose job is to serve and protect." James nodded hesitantly, unsure if pursuing justice was worth the risk. After all, he had spent most of his life avoiding conflict, knowing that standing up often meant getting knocked down harder. David reassured him, emphasizing that this wasn't just about James. It was about setting a precedent. If they could hold officers Mark and Ryan accountable, it might prevent similar incidents in the future. James finally agreed, signing a document authorizing David to represent him. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not for himself necessarily, but for the possibility of making a difference. As preparations for the case began, support poured in from unexpected places. Donations flooded into a crowdfunding campaign set up by Sarah and Lisa, raising funds to cover James's legal fees and provide him with temporary housing and medical care. Strangers sent letters of encouragement, expressing admiration for his resilience and gratitude for inspiring change. Local businesses offered assistance, donating clothes, meals, and other necessities. Even the mayor issued a statement acknowledging James's plight and pledging resources to address homelessness in the community. Despite the overwhelming support, challenges remained. Officers Mark and Ryan dug in their heels, refusing to admit wrongdoing. Their union rallied behind them, arguing that they were being unfairly targeted. Supporters of the officers accused the media of sensationalizing the story, claiming that James had somehow provoked the confrontation. These counter-arguments sparked heated debates online, dividing communities and reigniting discussions about privilege, bias, and accountability. Through it all, James kept moving forward, buoyed by the knowledge that he wasn't alone anymore. Though the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, he drew strength from the growing movement surrounding him. Every protest, every donation, every kind word reminded him that his voice, though silent, had resonated deeply with others. And as the trial date approached, James realized that this wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about reclaiming his dignity, challenging stereotypes, and proving that even the most invisible among us can spark meaningful change. In the weeks leading up to the trial, the town transformed. Conversations shifted from indifference to empathy, from apathy to action. Schools incorporated lessons on compassion and equality into their curriculums. Churches organized drives to collect supplies for the homeless. Community centers hosted workshops on conflict resolution and cultural sensitivity. Slowly but surely, the ripple effects of James's story began reshaping the fabric of the town, reminding everyone that even in moments of darkness, there is always room for light. For James, these changes brought a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Though scars remained, both visible and invisible, he started imagining a future where he might find stability, connection, and peace. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. Hope that his ordeal would lead to something greater. Hope that his silence would speak volumes. And hope that the world would finally see him, not as a burden or a nuisance, but as a person deserving of respect and humanity. The trial against officers Mark and Ryan began on a chilly morning. The courtroom packed with spectators eager to witness the outcome of what had become a landmark case. Reporters jostled for seats near the front, their notebooks ready to capture every detail. Protesters gathered outside holding banners that read, "Justice for James and End Police Brutality." Inside, the atmosphere was tense, charged with emotion as lawyers, witnesses, and the judge prepared to delve into the events that had sparked outrage across the nation. James sat quietly in the corner of the room, flanked by his lawyer David and journalist Lisa, who had become a trusted ally. He looked smaller than ever, his weathered face betraying both fear and determination. For someone who couldn't speak, his presence spoke volumes. His silence commanded attention, forcing everyone in the room to confront the humanity they often overlooked when passing him on the streets. James's eyes darted nervously between the officers sitting confidently at the defendant's table and the jury tasked with deciding their fate. Despite the overwhelming support he'd received, doubt lingered in his mind. Would justice truly be served? David opened the proceedings with a powerful statement, painting a vivid picture of the abuse James endured. "This isn't just about one man being mistreated," he declared, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's about accountability. It's about recognizing the inherent worth of every individual, regardless of their circumstances. James may not have a voice, but his story demands to be heard." To drive home his point, David played Sarah's viral video for the court. The footage was even more harrowing in person, each cruel word and violent act amplified by the solemnity of the setting. Gasps rippled through the audience as they watched officers Mark and Ryan taunt and physically assault James, leaving him sprawled on the sidewalk like an unwanted object. When the video ended, there was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by the sound of someone sobbing softly in the back row. The defense team representing Mark and Ryan tried to downplay the incident, portraying it as a routine interaction gone wrong. Their lead attorney argued that the officers were simply following protocol, dealing with a non-compliant individual who refused to cooperate. They claimed James's muteness led to confusion, implying that his inability to respond justified their aggressive behavior. However, this argument fell flat under scrutiny. Witnesses testified about the officers' history of misconduct, presenting evidence of previous complaints filed by residents who described similar patterns of hostility and excessive force. One Particularly damning testimony came from a retired police officer named Thomas, who had worked alongside Mark and Ryan earlier in his career. Though hesitant to testify against former colleagues, Thomas felt compelled to speak out after seeing the video. "These men don't understand what it means to serve and protect," he said firmly, his voice tinged with disappointment. "They see their badge as a weapon, not a responsibility. I've seen them escalate situations unnecessarily time and again. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was inevitable." As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented additional evidence, including internal communications within the police department that revealed attempts to suppress the body cam footage. Emails showed supervisors advising Mark and Ryan to delete or alter records related to the incident, raising questions about corruption at higher levels. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, further eroding public trust in law enforcement. Throughout the proceedings, James remained stoic, though his hands trembled slightly whenever the spotlight shifted to him. During breaks, Lisa would offer reassuring words, reminding him how far he'd come. "You're doing great," she whispered during one recess. "Just keep holding on, we're here with you." Sarah, too, visited regularly, bringing updates on the growing movement inspired by James's story. She told him about rallies happening nationwide, where people chanted his name and demanded systemic reforms. Hearing these stories brought tears to James's eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt seen. By the final day of the trial, tensions reached a boiling point. Both sides delivered closing arguments, their words echoing through the packed courtroom. The defense reiterated their claim that the officers acted within reason, urging the jury to consider the challenges faced by law enforcement. But David countered with a stirring reminder of why the case mattered. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his tone unwavering, "this is your chance to send a message, to say that cruelty disguised as authority will not be tolerated. James deserves justice, yes, but so does our community. Let us choose compassion over cruelty, accountability over impunity." After hours of deliberation, the verdict was announced. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood to deliver the decision. "Guilty," she declared, her voice clear and resolute. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of disbelief and relief. Officers Mark and Ryan slumped in their seats, their arrogance replaced by shame. They were ordered to pay $500 each in damages, a symbolic amount meant to acknowledge wrongdoing rather than compensate fully for the harm caused. While some criticized the fine as inadequate, others saw it as a step toward accountability. For James, the victory wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming his dignity and proving that his life had value. As the crowd erupted into applause, he allowed himself a small smile, tears streaming down his cheeks. David patted him on the shoulder, congratulating him on a hard-fought win. Outside, protesters cheered, chanting James's name as if he were a hero. And perhaps, in a way, he was. In the days following the trial, the town continued to grapple with the aftermath. The police department implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory sensitivity training for all officers and stricter oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuses of power. Community leaders launched initiatives aimed at addressing homelessness, recognizing the systemic issues that left people like James vulnerable to exploitation and neglect. Local businesses pledged resources to create shelters and job programs, offering tangible solutions to long-standing problems. Meanwhile, James's life began to change in unexpected ways. Donations poured in from supporters nationwide, enabling him to secure temporary housing in a modest apartment. For the first time in years, he had walls to call his own and a roof over his head. Volunteers helped furnish the space with essentials, bedding, kitchen supplies, and even a second-hand television. Neighbors welcomed him warmly, inviting him to join them for meals and conversations. Slowly but surely, James started rebuilding, his life finding joy in simple pleasures he had forgotten existed. Lisa stayed in touch, documenting James's journey for her book about the case. She interviewed him frequently, using written notes to bridge the gap created by his muteness. Through their conversations, she uncovered layers of resilience and wisdom that inspired readers worldwide. Her portrayal of James as a survivor rather than a victim resonated deeply, challenging stereotypes and fostering empathy. Sarah also remained active, channeling her newfound platform into advocacy work. She founded an organization dedicated to amplifying marginalized voices, organizing workshops and campaigns to educate communities about bias and inequality. Her efforts earned widespread recognition, transforming her from a bystander into a leader, yet she never forgot the moment that changed everything, the moment she chose to record instead of look away. As for Officers Mark and Ryan, their careers lay in ruins. Stripped of their badges and facing widespread condemnation, they became pariahs in the community they once policed. Some defended them, arguing that the punishment was too harsh, while others viewed them as cautionary tales about unchecked authority. Regardless of opinion, their downfall served as a stark reminder of the consequences of prejudice and abuse. Years later, James reflected on how far he'd come. Sitting in his cozy apartment, surrounded by letters of support from strangers turned friends, he marveled at the ripple effects of his ordeal. What started as a moment of cruelty had transformed into a beacon of hope, not just for him, but for countless others fighting for fairness and equality. He still carried scars, both visible and invisible, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they reminded him of his strength and the power of standing up, even silently, for what's right. Though life hadn't been kind to James, he found solace in knowing that his story had ignited meaningful progress. Injustice might persist, but so too would the courage to challenge it. And as long as people like James, Sarah, Lisa, and David continued to fight, there was always hope for a better tomorrow. The months following the trial brought profound changes not only to James's life, but also to the town itself. The verdict against Officers Mark and Ryan had sent shockwaves through the community, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, privilege, and systemic injustice. For many residents, it was a wake-up call, a moment to reflect on how they treated those less fortunate and whether their actions aligned with the values they claimed to hold dear. Conversations that had once been brushed aside were now front and center, sparking debates, initiatives, and even personal transformations. James, who had spent years living in the shadows, found himself at the heart of this transformation. Though he still couldn't speak, his story spoke volumes, inspiring others to take action. Local schools began incorporating lessons about empathy and equality into their curriculums, using James's case as a real-life example of why kindness matters. Churches and community centers organized drives to collect supplies for the homeless, ensuring no one went without basic necessities like food, blankets, or toiletries. Even businesses stepped up, offering discounted services or job opportunities to marginalized individuals. Slowly but surely, the town started shifting from indifference to inclusion. One of the most significant changes came in the form of policy reforms within the police department. Under mounting public pressure, city officials implemented sweeping measures aimed at rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community. Mandatory sensitivity training programs were introduced, emphasizing de-escalation techniques, cultural awareness, and emotional intelligence. Officers were required to attend workshops led by social workers and mental health professionals, learning how to approach situations with compassion rather than aggression. Body cameras became mandatory, with strict penalties for tampering or failing to record interactions. An independent oversight committee was established to review complaints and ensure accountability. These reforms weren't perfect, and skepticism lingered among some residents. Critics argued that policies alone couldn't erase decades of mistrust, pointing out that change needed to come from within. Still, there was undeniable progress. New recruits entering the force underwent rigorous vetting processes designed to weed out candidates prone to prejudice or excessive force. Veteran officers participated in peer mentoring programs, encouraging open dialogue about challenges faced on the job while reinforcing ethical standards. While tensions remained, the atmosphere began to shift, from hostility to hope. For James, adapting to his new reality wasn't easy. After years of surviving on the streets, the comforts of an apartment felt foreign yet comforting. His modest home, though small, offered stability, a luxury he hadn't experienced in over a decade. Neighbors checked in regularly, bringing homemade meals or simply sitting with him for companionship. Volunteers helped him navigate daily tasks, teaching him how to use appliances and manage finances. Though grateful, James often felt overwhelmed by the sudden influx of attention. He wasn't used to being cared for, let alone celebrated. Lisa continued documenting James's journey, capturing moments of triumph and vulnerability alike. Her book, titled Silent Voice: The Story of James, became a bestseller, resonating with readers across the country. Through her words, she painted a portrait of resilience, highlighting not just James's hardships but also his quiet strength and unwavering humanity. Readers wrote letters thanking Lisa for sharing such a powerful narrative, many admitting they'd never considered the struggles faced by homeless individuals until reading the book. Some even volunteered at shelters or donated to organizations supporting similar causes, inspired to make a difference in their own communities. Sarah's advocacy work flourished as well. The organization she founded, named Amplify Voices, grew rapidly, attracting volunteers and donors eager to support its mission. She traveled extensively, speaking at conferences and hosting workshops to educate people about bias and inequality. Her message was simple yet profound. Everyone deserves to be seen and heard, regardless of their circumstances. By amplifying marginalized voices, Sarah believed society could move closer to true justice and equality. Her efforts earned her national recognition, including awards for community leadership and humanitarianism. Yet despite her growing fame, she remained grounded, crediting James for giving her the courage to act. As time passed, James began finding ways to contribute to the movement he had unintentionally sparked. With David's encouragement, he started attending town hall meetings, using written notes to share his thoughts and experiences. At first, he hesitated, unsure if anyone would listen. But to his surprise, people hung on to every word, moved by the raw honesty of his story. His presence reminded them that behind every statistic or headline was a human being with dreams, fears, and untapped potential. James became a symbol of perseverance, proof that even the most invisible among us can spark meaningful change. The ripple effects of James's case extended far beyond the town. Across the nation, communities rallied around similar causes, demanding accountability for police misconduct and advocating for systemic reforms. Protesters carried signs bearing James's name, chanting slogans inspired by his journey. Social media campaigns highlighted stories of other victims of abuse, creating networks of solidarity and support. Policymakers took notice, introducing legislation aimed at addressing homelessness, poverty, and discrimination. Though progress was slow and incremental, momentum was building. Back in the town where it all began, life slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. People greeted each other more warmly, taking time to acknowledge neighbors they might have ignored before. Acts of kindness became commonplace, from leaving spare change at bus stops to volunteering at local shelters. Businesses displayed posters promoting inclusivity, reminding customers that everyone deserved respect. These small gestures added up, fostering a sense of unity and shared purpose. Despite the positive changes, challenges persisted. Not everyone embraced the movement. Some clung to old prejudices, dismissing calls for reform as unnecessary or exaggerated. Tensions occasionally flared, particularly during heated discussions about policing practices or resource allocation. Yet even skeptics couldn't deny the impact James's story had made. Whether through grudging admiration or reluctant acceptance, they acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted in the town's collective consciousness. For James, the biggest challenge lay in reconciling his past with his present. Nights were often restless, haunted by memories of the cruelty he had endured. During these moments, he turned to writing, filling pages of his notebook with reflections on pain, healing, and hope. Sometimes he shared excerpts with Lisa, who included them in her book. Other times he kept them private, using the act of writing as a form of therapy. Each word was a step toward reclaiming his identity, not as a victim but as a survivor. By the end of the year, James had settled into a routine that, while humble, brought him immense satisfaction. He spent mornings volunteering at a nearby shelter, helping serve meals to others who had once walked in his shoes. Afternoons were reserved for appointments with doctors and therapists, addressing physical and emotional wounds accumulated over the years. Evenings were quieter, allowing him time to reflect or read books recommended by Lisa. On weekends, he joined community events, connecting with neighbors and forming friendships he never thought possible. Though scars remained, both visible and invisible, James no longer let them define him. Instead, he viewed them as reminders of his resilience, testaments to the strength he discovered when pushed to his limits. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but he faced it with a newfound sense of purpose. Every day was an opportunity to give back, to inspire others, and to prove that silence doesn't mean weakness. It can be a source of power. As winter approached, the town prepared for its annual holiday festival, a celebration of unity and gratitude. This year, organizers decided to honor James, inviting him to light the ceremonial tree. Standing before a crowd of cheering supporters, James held the switch in trembling hands, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. When the lights flickered on, bathing the square in warmth and color, applause erupted around him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to bask in the glow, not just of the twinkling bulbs, but of the love and respect he had earned. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky, James stood quietly on the sidelines, watching families laugh and embrace. A young boy approached him, holding out a candy cane wrapped in shiny red foil. "This is for you, Mr. James," the child said shyly, smiling up at him. James accepted the gift, nodding his thanks, too choked with emotion to write a response. As the boy ran back to his parents, James slipped the candy cane into his pocket, vowing to keep it forever, a sweet reminder that even in the darkest times light could shine through. Though his journey had been long and difficult, James finally felt at peace. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years he looked forward to finding out. Life had taught him that happiness wasn't guaranteed, but neither was despair. It was the choices we made, the connections we forged, the battles we fought, that defined us. And James, silent though he was, had chosen to stand tall. In doing so, years had passed since the trial that changed James's life and the lives of countless others, but its impact lingered like ripples in a pond, spreading farther than anyone could have imagined. The town where it all began was no longer the same place. Streets once lined with neglect now bore signs of hope and renewal. Homeless shelters expanded their capacities, offering not just beds but counseling, job training, and medical care. Community gardens sprouted in vacant lots, tended by volunteers who turned barren spaces into vibrant sanctuaries. Conversations about equality and justice became part of everyday life, woven into the fabric of the town's identity. James, too, had transformed. Once a shadowy figure on the fringes of society, he was now a beloved member of the community. His apartment, though modest, reflected his journey. Photos taped to the walls showed him smiling alongside neighbors at festivals, volunteering at shelters, or sitting quietly with Lisa as she interviewed him for updates to her best-selling book. Though he still couldn't speak, his presence spoke louder than words ever could. People sought him out not out of pity but out of admiration, eager to learn from his resilience and quiet wisdom. Every morning, James followed the same routine. He woke early, dressed warmly, and walked to the local shelter where he volunteered. There he served meals, sorted donations, and offered companionship to those who felt invisible. He understood their pain intimately, having lived it himself, and his empathy made him uniquely suited to connect with them. Many credited him with helping them rebuild their lives, saying his example gave them strength when they thought they had none left. For James, these moments weren't about gratitude, they were about connection. They reminded him that he wasn't alone, that even in silence he belonged. As time went on, James's story continued inspiring change far beyond the borders of his small town. Lisa's book, Silent Voice, The Story of James, became required. reading in schools and universities nationwide, sparking discussions about privilege, bias, and systemic inequality. Readers wrote heartfelt letters to James, sharing how his journey had touched their lives. Some described volunteering at shelters after finishing the book. Others recounted standing up against injustice in their own communities. Each letter reinforced what James already knew. One person's courage can ignite a movement. Sarah, meanwhile, had grown into a national advocate for marginalized voices. Her organization, Amplify Voices, expanded exponentially, opening chapters in cities across the country. Through workshops, campaigns, and partnerships with grassroots groups, Sarah worked tirelessly to ensure that stories like James didn't go unheard. She often credited him with giving her purpose, saying, "If I hadn't recorded that video, I might never have realized the power of speaking up. James taught me that silence isn't weakness. It's a call to action." David, the lawyer who represented James, dedicated his practice to fighting similar cases, ensuring that victims of abuse received the justice they deserved. Inspired by James's case, he founded a legal clinic offering free services to marginalized individuals, partnering with advocacy groups to address systemic issues within law enforcement. "This isn't just about winning lawsuits," David often said. "It's about creating a world where lawsuits like this aren't necessary." For Officers Mark and Ryan, life took a very different turn. Stripped of their badges and ostracized by the community, they struggled to find work or rebuild their reputations. Their names became synonymous with abuse of power, cited in lectures and articles about accountability. While some defended them, arguing that the punishment was too harsh, others saw their downfall as a warning, a reminder that authority comes with responsibility. Their story served as a cautionary tale, underscoring the importance of integrity and compassion in positions of trust. Back in the town, the ripple effects of James's ordeal continued reshaping institutions and attitudes. The police department underwent further reforms, introducing programs aimed at fostering trust between officers and residents. New recruits learned about de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and the dangers of implicit bias. Annual reviews ensured compliance with ethical standards, while an independent oversight board monitored complaints and addressed grievances promptly. Though challenges remained, the department gradually earned back some measure of respect, proving that change, however slow, was possible. Community leaders also embraced the spirit of transformation, launching initiatives to tackle homelessness head-on. Affordable housing projects broke ground, funded by grants and private donations. Job fairs connected unemployed individuals with employers willing to give them a second chance. Mental health clinics opened their doors, providing free counseling and support to those struggling with trauma or addiction. These efforts didn't solve every problem overnight, but they laid the foundation for lasting progress. One particularly significant development came when the mayor announced the creation of a memorial park dedicated to victims of police misconduct. Located near the site of James's encounter with officers Mark and Ryan, the park featured benches, trees, and plaques honoring those who had suffered silently. At its center stood a statue of James, an abstract figure gazing upward, symbolizing resilience and hope. On the day of its unveiling, hundreds gathered to pay tribute, including Lisa, Sarah, and many whose lives James had touched. As the crowd applauded, tears streamed down James's face, not of sadness, but of pride. He had come full circle, from being kicked out of the park to becoming its eternal guardian. Despite the progress, James remained humble, aware that his journey wasn't over. Nights were still difficult, haunted by memories of cruelty and isolation. During these moments, he turned to writing, filling pages of his notebook with reflections on healing and forgiveness. Sometimes he shared excerpts with Lisa, who included them in updated editions of her book. Other times he kept them private, using the act of writing as a form of therapy. Each word was a step toward reclaiming his identity, not as a victim but as a survivor. As the years rolled on, James found joy in simple pleasures, watching children play in the park, sipping coffee with neighbors, or flipping through old photo albums. He cherished the friendships he had formed, treasuring the bonds that had once seemed impossible. Even strangers greeted him warmly, calling him by name and thanking him for inspiring change. Though he couldn't respond verbally, his smile said everything. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled around him, James sat on a bench near the memorial park. A young girl approached him, holding out a drawing she had made, a colorful picture of the park, complete with stick figures playing beneath the trees. "This is for you, Mr. James," she said shyly, her voice barely above a whisper. James accepted the gift, nodding his thanks, too moved to write a response. As the girl skipped away, he studied the drawing carefully, tracing the lines with his fingers. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, beauty could emerge. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, James reflected on how far he'd come. Life had dealt him countless blows, yet resilience carried him through. In the end, what started as a moment of cruelty transformed into a beacon of hope, not just for him, but for everyone willing to fight for a fairer world. Though scars remained, James wore them proudly, knowing they told a story of survival, courage, and triumph. As he walked home under a canopy of stars, James allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He didn't know what the future held, but he faced it with unwavering determination. Every day was an opportunity to give back, to inspire others, and to prove that even the most invisible among us can spark meaningful change. And so, with quiet dignity, James stepped forward, carrying his silent voice into a brighter tomorrow.